2014 has come and gone, and so it's time for our year-end review. What are the highlights for you? What stands out most in your memory? What's your favorite Pope Francis moment? Joining me tonight is a panel of Salt and Light producers. But first, lots has happened in 2014, so let's refresh our memory. Okay, so let's cut to the chase. Joining me tonight are Stefan Slovak, Sebastian Gomes, and Alicia Ambrosio. Welcome, you guys. We have a lot to cover. So what would you say is the biggest news story for you personally this year?
I think the U.S.-Cuba rapprochement.
Right, happened in December, yes.
And the fact that both leaders just blurted out, oh, by the way, we'd like to thank Pope Francis for helping us make this possible.
Well, and it was interesting how not all the media outlets covered that part of it. Right?
Yeah. It caught everyone off by surprise. No one saw this coming. This was really done really well under the radar. It's a type of papal diplomacy that we haven't seen in a long time.
Right, and apparently even when President Obama met with Pope Francis in August or June or March.
Yeah.
Thank you. They were already talking about that. That's what I.
Yeah, and there's some reports saying that Cardinal Pietro Parolin actually mediated one round of the talks between the U.S. and Cuba. So that, it's this whole level of papal involvement in international politics that we haven't seen in a long time.
Big story.
It's so unique. I just wanted to chime in and pick up on what Alicia was saying because, like, for example, if you look at the Catholic Church's presence at the United Nations, for example, it's such a unique role because the Church is the only kind of representation that doesn't have an agenda. You know, the agenda is peace, is building a better world, is bringing people together. It's not a kind of partisan, agenda that's looking at our own interests first and foremost, and then doing diplomacy as best we can with other countries.
Yeah, but it's also become the one body that nobody expects to get into the middle of certain international issues.
Right.
No, but it's great, and it's also, I think, the one body that nobody would question. Like, why are they getting involved? Of course, peace, right? Good. Okay. I'm just plowing through here.
Yeah, I think biggest news story of the year for me, there were two papal trips that Pope Francis made, both with the Ecumenical Patriarch of the Orthodox Church, Bartholomew. First, they went to the Holy Land together to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the meeting of Paul VI with the Patriarch's predecessor, Athenagoras. They made another joint statement where they promised that they would pursue, that ecumenical conversation some more, and they made some joint statements about supporting Christians in the world, especially places where they're being persecuted. But just at a historical level, besides the fact that these two guys really like each other personally, this is so significant because it's basically a 1,000-year rift between these two churches, and now we're coming together even at a more speedy pace than we could have imagined because of these two guys at the helm.
When we talk about later on what to look forward in 2015, maybe that's one of the things that we need to look at.
Absolutely.
Stefan.
For myself, it's also the situation involving Cuba and the United States. This is a process. It is a huge, massive shift in geopolitics in the Western Hemisphere. If you think of the history behind the United States, behind Cuba, going back to the Cuban Revolution in the late 50s, then you had the embargo placed on Cuba by the United States, and then what ultimately culminated in the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is one of the single most important moments in the 20th century. And it's important to look at the link between this coming together of the two countries with the Pope and what happened during the missile crisis. It's no secret that John the 23rd was talking to both President Kennedy and Khrushchev during the crisis to try and bring about some kind of an end to it. You know, ultimately that did end up peacefully. We did not end up with a nuclear war on our hands. And I find it really, people often draw the parallels between Francis and John, and I think that Francis's involvement here really reignites, like you were saying before, the diplomatic role on the really the highest levels of global diplomacy of the papacy. Yeah.
Now, a lot of those stories are always accompanied by photos, footage. Bartholomew, there's this great photo of the Patriarch kissing Pope Francis's head. It's a beautiful photo, so that's a photo that stands out for me. Any other images like that stand out for you guys during the year?
Well, there are two. I was doing the coverage of the trip to the Holy Land, and there were two there. One was when Francis stopped the Pope Mobile and prayed in front of the dividing wall.
In Bethlehem.
That, I mean, it ignited all kinds of controversy, but standing there praying in front of this really hideous wall full of graffiti, so symbolic. And the second one was also in Israel, when he was praying in front of the Western Wall with his two friends.
Yes.
With Rabbi Skorka and Omar Aboud.
Yes.
And this spontaneous, really it was Rabbi Skorka who just looked like he was about to, levitate with joy.
Yes.
But that was so symbolic of something that is much needed, especially all of that going on, that happening when you've got all of this tension brewing in that region between Muslims and Christians and Jews.
And it was both unexpected moments. Photo.
And actually, I just thought of this right now, but building on that, then we saw the leaders of the Palestinians and the Israelis meeting in the Vatican with the Pope, and there were some more beautiful images there, but that was a result of the Pope's presence in the Holy Land and some of those images that you were talking about. For me, a little bit more shameless self-promotion here, but when I was in Rome for the Synod of Bishops in October, I actually watched a professional camera person take a picture of our own producers, Charles LeBourgeois and Rodney Leung, taking a selfie with Pope Francis. Yes. Obviously, there's tons of selfies now with Pope Francis out there, but...
And tons of Rodney selfies.
And tons of them are Rodney selfies, but this one in particular was just phenomenal to see a picture of a selfie being taken. Yes. What a great shot.
Beautiful. Stefan.
For myself, going back to the Holy Land, Pope Francis in front of the graffiti. I mean, more so, I think you look at what it said. Pope, we need someone to speak about justice. Bethlehem looks like Warsaw Ghetto. The politics that ignited. I mean, he had to make, in addition to his trip, because he was headed straight to Israel, he was slammed by the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and he was slammed by everybody, talking about it as slick propaganda by the Palestinian Authority. It created quite a rough rift, considering he was about to go to Israel.
And it wasn't planned.
No,
and
it
wasn't on the schedule.
They had to add something to his schedule. The State of Israel then sort of said, you need to do something to counter that. So for me, that image, just everything behind it, the power of it, that to me is the image of the year.
Yeah, no, a picture says 1,000 words.
But there's one more that we forgot.
Okay.
The Pope kneeling to go to confession.
Yes. Yes, I actually
have video
have another one. And I have another one and this was not a real photo, but it was doctored. But the photo of Francis and Benedict praying together, but then someone doctored with the Argentina flag and the Germany flag
during the World Cup. Yes,
it was very good. Anyway, with those pictures are quite often quotes, things that the Holy Father has said. He's great for sound bites. I have one. Pope Francis shunning the bulletproof vest, or the bulletproof Pope Mobile, not the vest, in June, and he had just come back from the Holy Land, but he said, it's true that anything could happen, but let's face it, at my age, I don't have much to lose. I love the guy.
I don't think the Swiss Guard feel the same way. I think
that's very true.
No, yes,
their employment maybe.
I think they're used to it by now. Yeah. Seriously.
There's a great sense of just, lightheartedness, though, and freedom about him, isn't there? And just the way he carries himself, and he's a free person. He's found himself in this role. He's extremely humble about it, but man, some of those lines that he comes out with about his own security. And,
well, even what he said, what was it that he said?
Jorge, if you change at your age, it would be ridiculous.
Yes.
And that, I guarantee you, does not sound half as good as it does in the original Jorge.
Some profound wisdom there.
Si no es el ridículo.
Che, pero serías ridículo.
I know. Those are great. Any other
I just
quotes or statements, profound statements?
Briefly, most significant one I think of the year, when he was on the plane coming back from Korea, someone asked him about China, whether or not he'd go to China. I'm going to the paper here. He said, am I willing to go to China? Of course I am. I'd go tomorrow if possible. China is a place on this Pope's radar Rodney told me a great story actually before the Synod. He went for one of the general audiences, and he was holding a Chinese flag, and as the Pope was driving by on the Pope-mobile, everybody was saying, you know, Papa Francesco, and Rodney was saying, pray for China, as loud as he can, and the Pope stopped, turned and looked at Rodney, pointed to him, and gave him the thumbs up like this. A really powerful story, but China is on this Pope's radar, so that was a very significant.
Okay, so you're already on number 2 for things to look forward to in 2015. He's not going to go to China, but maybe, exactly. Anything for you, Stefan?
For me, it's not just one quote, but it's a whole speech. It was a speech to the European Parliament this year, not to be confused with his speech to the Council of Europe.
Yes.
But his speech to the European Parliament was a massive criticism of the institution, of the continent, and what it's become. He called it all kinds of things like haggard, less of a protagonist in the world. He really took a deep, deep shot at it. And interestingly enough, the only people that were happy to say things about the Pope beforehand, everyone was happy the Pope was visiting. The only people that were agreeable to speak even to the media about him afterwards were the Eurosceptic parties who have concerns about the European Union becoming over-intrusive.
Right.
So it's strange how that, you know, how such a positive event then for the European Union turned into not great PR.
That was a fascinating talk too, because Pope Francis was really picking up on things that Pope Benedict had said before. So you saw a bridge there between the two popes.
Absolutely, and there's tons. I mean, we just don't have time. We're going to take a little break. When we come back, we're going to continue looking at highlights of 2014, looking at the Holy Father's travels, and what to look forward to in this year, 2015. So stay tuned.
Let us know your perspective. Email us at perspectives@saltandlighttv.org or reach us by mail, Perspectives at Salt and Light Television, 114 Richmond Street East, Toronto, Ontario, M5C 1P1, or call us toll-free at 1-888-302-7181. Let your perspective be heard.
We're looking at highlights of 2014, and as it happens with church news, and that's our job, is that sometimes it's not covered exactly the same way in secular or the mainstream media, and we thought that there's a lot of news stories that are not really news stories. So biggest non-news news story or story inaccurately.
Well, I think one that towards the end of the year that we can talk about. I think you could even put it on the ridiculous of headlines, is that the Pope says all dogs go to heaven.
Yes.
Meeting the young boy in St. Peter's Square.
Which didn't even happen.
Yeah, exactly. It's such a complete and total just debauchery of what happened. I mean, I was talking...
Of what didn't happen, yeah, exactly.
Well, exactly what didn't happen. I was talking to a theologian friend of mine who knows Revelation quite well, and said there's even a part there that clearly states that the dogs are outside the gates of heaven. So unless the Pope's changing Scripture, then dogs are probably not
we
going
might get
to
some
heaven.
mail on that, because I think there's theological debate on that. But anyway, anything else?
Well, as I mentioned before, I was at the Synod of Bishops in October, and right in the middle of that 2-week synod, there was a report that was published. It's called the Midterm Report, and it's basically like a mirror image of the conversation of the first week, and that's its whole purpose, And then the second week of the synod, they go a little bit deeper into the issues, and then come to the conclusion at the end. Anyway, when that midterm report was published, the language of it was very open and welcoming, and this created this massive controversy in the press, because people were saying, oh my gosh, the church is changing its teaching on homosexuality and communion for divorced and remarried people and everything. And all of us at the Vatican are saying, this document carries absolutely zero weight, like 0.0.
Like this is not news.
Well, and I think going along with that, though, when the final document came out, most media were reporting it as the Pope lost his attempt to reform
the cardinals
the church.
against the Pope.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think we all got caught in situations where we were called on by secular media to comment, and the question was, so what does this say about the Pope's power? But it also says
Parliament.
that. But it also says we're not doing the right job. The church is not doing enough to communicate how a synod works.
The optics of that situation were everything. I mean, you know, that was an internal report, and it wasn't necessarily meant to say change something within the catechism of the church. However, it's 90% of things are optics. What that at face value what things are. Yeah. And it's important that if a message is going to be conveyed, that you do so thinking about all the possible consequences and moving forward for the Vatican. That is critical.
And in the context of this particular, the release of this particular document, the Vatican had actually changed its policy for this synod and hadn't made any of the summaries or the interventions of the bishops public, which in previous synods they had all been public. So here they're basically saying, no, we're not going to put out this information, but we are going to put out the midterm report.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, so maybe they could have looked at the situation and said, how is this going to look?
Well, no, I think it was also the communication system at the Vatican was caught off guard by how this. Well,
not to mention the media receiving it before the bishops did, and that in and of itself.
Yes.
While they were hearing it being,
we
were sitting there listening to it, and I was like, I wonder how this is going on.
Yeah, but what was really shocking there, and this is why I think something else is going on behind the scenes, because a lot of the media that ran with the story that, you know, the church is changing its teaching were media outlets that have permanent correspondence in Rome, and they know how it works.
Should know better.
And frankly, they were, like, the UK media was lambasting their colleagues who were running their secular
and it's
colleagues.
interesting, and correct me if I'm wrong because I don't remember, but I think it was the Holy Father himself a couple general audiences later who was actually explaining this is how a synod works. It's not a parliament, it's a synod. This is what synod means, and then he went on to explain things. So yeah, maybe we need to do a better job, but I think we tried to, you know, anyway, the mainstream media is going to do whatever they want to do. Anyway.
We can help them as much as we can.
Yes, absolutely. Now, for you personally, we've all interviewed lots of people, covered lots of stories, you've done some traveling. What was the event or story or interview that most impacted you personally?
Let me jump in there because I just want to actually continue with kind of builds on what we were talking about with the synod. At the synod, the Pope gave two addresses. One at the beginning to kind of push it in a particular direction, open, honest conversation, respectful listening, and then at the end he said, he stood up and he said, this is what I've heard at the synod. These are the temptations that I've seen at play within the conversation. This is what the church is about, and this is the way we're going to go forward. And that address, that final address on October 18th, 2014, was, I think, the most significant address of his pontificate so far. And when I was sitting there in the room, I was like, this is a historic moment. Like, I am witnessing with my eyes the Pope standing up and all the bishops, representative bishops of the world, listening to this. And I remember thinking to myself, you know, someone should really be recording this on camera. And then I turned to my right, and Rodney was sitting right next to me. And like Rodney, only Rodney can do, has his own little camera sitting there with the big red light on. Recording. I'm like, oh boy, yeah, we're being really inconspicuous here at the back of the Synod Hall. But that was an unbelievable moment to experience for me personally.
So I was here, I didn't get to go to Rome, but we had the former head of Jesuit Refugee Services, Father Peter Belay, come in, and I got to talk to him. And he was speaking about the situation in Syria and what JRS has done there and how they've seen things change. And he said something really powerful, that if you had asked him a couple of years ago if Syria could be in that situation, that whole region could be in that situation that they are in today, he would have never thought it was possible. And so he was talking about how really evil how it perpetuates itself. And that was something really powerful about, like, let's stop and apply that criteria to what's going on, and analyze how evil is getting into the international system and perpetuating itself. But the other thing, and I think this got missed quite a bit by the English language media, I was watching the Mass for Our Lady of Guadalupe, and the homily was in Spanish. The Misa Criollo, it is in my blood. Yes. This is the music of my family's heritage, so I have a connection to this, but the homily, there was something about the mixture of this music that uses the indigenous forms of South American music with this homily that Pope Francis delivered. And it was essentially, to really paraphrase it, he was basically telling anyone who thinks they can exploit South America and Latin America, get your hands off. And get your hands off, and reminding Latin Americans, we have a mother. We have a mother, and she's gotten us this far.
Beautiful.
And I think that was highly, it was missed. It was missed by a lot of the media.
Yeah. Well, Stefan?
For me personally, when I was at the Plenary Assembly of the Canadian Bishops in Quebec, we got to stay for a weekend afterwards for the first ever Prison Chaplains Conference. It was organized by Bishop Gary Gordon, who himself has done a lot of work in prison ministry. And the kind of things that were happening there, the connections that were being made, the stories that were being told, were really quite something. It really sort of lifted the veil on the work the church does in the prison system here in Canada, and the extraordinary stories that you hear from laity, from deacons, priests, bishops. It's a story that we're going to tell. We interviewed a lot of folks, and it's a story that I think all people in Canada, Catholic and otherwise, really need to take notice of.
Yeah, no, for me, it's the little moment. I mean, we got the big things that are impactful. I mean, of course, the whole situation with ISIL, Islamic State, Ukraine, the Ebola crisis, Boko Haram, and I mean, there's so many big stories, but the little ones are quite often the ones that move us the most. In the little time that we have left, 2015 has begun. We got some papal trips planned, Philippines, Sri Lanka, next week. What should we keep our eyes on for this year?
Well, as far as papal trips go, I think the trip to the United States for the World Meeting of Families is going to be huge. There are rumored visits to the United Nations and to the United States Congress. And I think as big, I mean, not to take away from what's going to happen in Philadelphia, but if you look at what Pope Francis did in the European Parliament in 2014, there are a laundry list of items that he could take to the well, not just to the United Nations, but to the U.S. Congress, that I think will spark intense debate across the nation and around the world.
Well, and the rumor that he actually wants to go to El Paso, to go to the border, has been so outspoken about the migrants.
This is what I
don't think it's going to happen, but that would be wonderful.
Now, I mean, I'm sorry, Stefan, but I disagree with the fact that Philadelphia trip is going to be big. I think I think he's going to surprise a lot of people.
He's going to go to other Latin American countries,
and he might not go to the places in the U.S. where people want him to go. I've had a source say that. I've had a source tell me that the Pope has said, if Obama wants to meet me, he can come to me.
Well, yeah.
So I think people are overestimating, especially in North America, we overestimate the importance of North America, of the U.S. to the church. This Pope is about the peripheries. He's going to Philadelphia because there's a very important meeting of families going on there, but I think his heart is in El Paso. Even Mexico, I don't know if that's exactly the place he'll want to go. He told Elisabetta Piqué of La Nación that he's going to visit 2 Latin American nations in 2015, tacked on to that. It sounded like it's going to be tacked on to that trip. So let's look for the peripheries.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing. There's a lot of countries saying he's already told us he's coming.
Yes, just not when.
Well,
we certainly know that the invitation list is not short.
Yeah, okay, so what are you looking forward to this year?
Well, I mean, bring it around again, I think the conclusion of the Synod of Bishops is going to be huge for a couple reasons. I mean, one, it's first of all the end of this process that we're going through. Like the Pope is now, on his weekly general audiences, talking about the family. And he's talking about the family because this is the year that the church is now having this conversation at the local level about these very practical, tangible family issues that are then going to be brought back to the Synod. But ultimately, and the Pope reminded us that this in his last talk at the Synod, that he's the Pope.
Yes.
And the buck stops with him, so to speak. So even after this year's Synod in October, the Pope will have to do something with all of the material that's put together. So to wait to see what Pope Francis will write or come up with out of all these conversations are going to be incredible. And it's going to be something new. It's going to be something new because the document that they've sent to the local churches that's encouraging local dialogue at the local level specifically says it is not okay to just reiterate the doctrinal teachings of the church when it comes to the family. We must do something new. We have to look at the pastoral situations that people are in, and we have to talk about what is possible in terms of gospel charity and gospel justice in dealing with people in difficult situations.
That's going to be the interesting thing to watch over the next year in the lead up to that Synod. How many people who previously felt marginalized by their church or like they don't belong in their own church are going to start coming back?
Well, we have to leave it there. We could spend all afternoon talking about this. Lots going on. We've been talking to Stefan Slovak, Sebastian Gomes, and Alicia Ambrosio, all producers at Salt and Light Television. Now it's your turn to let us know what you think. Reach out to us through Facebook and Twitter. What was the highlight of 2014 for you? What are you looking forward to in 2015? Have a good night. May you have a blessed 2015.